Well, welcome everybody to DSLR Fast Start. My name is John Gringo, and today the subject is the Nikon D7100, 7100, or I might suppose it's the 7100. So it's a great camera, and it's the camera we're going to be talking about today. So let's go ahead and dive right in and show you what we're going to be doing today. So in this class, I want to give you a little bit of overview. Maybe you are brand new to Nikon SLRs and you want to know what you're getting involved in. So I'm going to do a little bit of that. We're going to go through a few basics. It's not a photography class that you're watching here. This is a camera-specific class. But there's a few basics I want to make sure everyone is up to speed on, so we'll spend just a few minutes doing that. The great majority of this class is going to be going through all the buttons on the camera. We are going to discuss every button, dial on the camera, talk about what it's good for and when you're going to most want to use it, and any implications of using it. We're going to go through the displays, what you see in the viewfinder, what you see in the LCD on the back of the camera. And I know it sounds terribly tedious, but we are going to go through the menu line item by line item. We're not going to spend a lot of time, but I will give you some recommended settings for both general users and advanced users. And obviously everyone's going to have their own little setups, but I'm going to kind of give you some tips and hints on how to set the camera up best for the type of photography that you want to do. And then to kind of put a bow on the end of it, around all of it at the end of the day, what we're going to do is we're going to go through and practice setting the camera up for different scenarios. So portrait, landscape, how to get maximum sharpness out of the camera and things like that, kind of which buttons are you going to go to most of the time. So let's dive in and talk about this camera. First off, you should reference this manual from time to time, although sitting down and reading it cover to cover will take you a little bit of time. There's a lot of information in there, there's a lot of valuable information, and I am not going to replicate or duplicate everything that is in the instruction manual. I am going to go through and whittle down what is in there to what I think is the most important elements of this camera. There is no way that I can stick 11 hours of information into our 5-hour class. The extra information that I'm not going to be covering covers a lot of areas that I know a lot of photographers don't really spend a lot of time on their cameras. For instance, there's a whole section on this camera where you can essentially Photoshop and tweak and adjust images after you've taken them. And while you can do it, and it's fun and might be a good way of wasting time while you're in an airport, it's not the best way of working with your images. You should be working on a computer with a large monitor that's color correct and working in a good program like Adobe Lightroom or Photoshop or any of another number of good programs. And so I'm not going to spend much time on things like that or doing slideshows or printing directly from your camera to a printer. And there's pages in the instruction manual on that, and we're barely even going to touch it in this class. We want to really figure out how to obtain the highest quality images with the greatest ease. That's what this class is all about. Now, if you are new to photography, if you haven't taken a photography class before, if you want to learn about depth of field and shutter speeds and apertures, you are going to be just woefully disappointed at this class because we do not really go into that in this class. This is really a gadget class on the Nikon D7100, and so if you don't know photography, there's other classes out there that I'll talk about that would be good for knowing about that. So let's get into the overview on this camera in particular. If you are new to the Nikon family, welcome. They've been around for a long time. They have one of the most respected names in photography. Started way back in 1917. They have pretty much dealt with 35mm cameras their entire time. These full-frame cameras are now digital, of course. Things got pretty serious in 1959 when they developed the single-lens reflex F, which has the same basic lens mount as our camera right here in front of us. Now, there is some limitations on lenses, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we get more into the lens section on the class. But the lens mount has remained, for the most part, unchanged. 1986 marked a big year because they started introducing autofocus lenses and autofocus cameras. And this camera can work with all the autofocus lenses that have ever come out. And so if you see something on sale on eBay or at a garage sale or at something like that, if it works, it's going to work on this camera. Lenses that are manual focus can still work, but with limited features as you go further and further back. Obviously, you're not going to get autofocus, but if you go far enough back, they may not even mount on the camera. And so you do have to be a little bit more careful with the older manual focus lenses. And then in 1999, they were kind of first to the market, you might say, in their professional digital camera. And if you're familiar with megapixels and cost of cameras now, this camera had 2.7 megapixels and sold for $5,000. And it was a revolution at the time, and people bought it up like crazy because it was the best deal out there, because the previous cameras were $15,000 that were modified Frankenstein cameras from Kodak using modified Nikon camera bodies. And so they've come a long ways in that time with their digital cameras. So for the 7100, good chance that if you're watching this, you already own it, and I'm not trying to sell you on the camera, but coming from what's been before in the lineup of Nikon cameras, what's great about this camera is the new 24 megapixel sensor. So for really high resolution, you now have that in here. You have an improved 51-point autofocus system. It's just got a few more points than the previous 39. Helps out a little bit in sporting type events. They've increased the frames per second. You can do 6 frames per second. And if you put the camera in a special 1.3 crop mode that we'll talk about, you can squeeze 7 frames per second out of it, albeit at a cost to the megapixels. It is also dust and water resistant, the same as the D600, D800 series cameras. And so while it's not quite submersible, it is pretty resistant to dust and rain. And finally, kind of a lot of talk about this. It's not really important in this class, and that is that this camera does not have what's called a low-pass filter. There's this filter that they usually put in front of the sensor to reduce moire, which is patterns that kind of match up inappropriately with the pixels in the camera. And they've taken that off of here because they have so many megapixels, it's in general not a problem. It's supposed to yield higher quality results, and it does, but only in a limited number of cases. And so while it's really interesting to read about in the review of the camera, in the actual operation of the camera, it's not really going to affect what you do or how you do with anything. So it's kind of a small point, and we'll be done with it at this point. So one of the best things about buying into the Nikon system is that there is a huge collection of cameras from Nikon, from low-end to high-end cameras. And so if you want to upgrade, if you want to buy your friend a similar mount camera but of much less money than this camera, there are plenty of options out there. You have tons of lenses. Nikon has been known for their fantastic lenses for many, many years. And so just about anything you want to do, they make a good lens for it, most likely. They also have arguably the best flash system on the market today. And so if you need flash, you shoot event photography, wedding, people photography, or any of our other things that use flash, macro photography, for instance, they have a fantastic lineup of flashes. I'm going to give you some recommendations on flashes when we get to that section of the class as well. All right, so the D7100 sits kind of in the middle class category of the Nikon lineup. It's strongly based off of the D7000 that came out a few years ago, and basically just comes down a long lineage of cameras, each one improving on the others. And just for reference, I owned the D70. That was my first digital SLR, because it was the first camera that Nikon brought out that broke, I think it broke the $1,000, or it was darn close to the $1,000 mark. That really became a good affordable camera, and just every successive version of this camera tends to get better and better, and this is definitely the best in this lineup so far. All right, so if you do page through that instruction manual, you're going to get to these pages and pages of warnings about things that you are not supposed to do with the camera, and they could replace all of those pages with just a simple line that says, "Don't be stupid with it." And I think we would all, we know we're not supposed to drop the camera or throw it in the water. But there's a couple of questions that people do have that are valid questions, and that is about the waterproofness of the camera. Because Nikon says it's not waterproof, but they do say it's dust and weather sealed. And what exactly does that mean? And they leave that very ambiguous. And they do that for a reason, is that they're not promising you it's going to work under any specific conditions. I guess the fact of the matter comes down for most people with rain. If it's raining outside, should I go out and take a picture? Well, I would not be afraid for a moment to go out and get a picture, but I wouldn't hang out there for a long period of time. If you're going to be shooting your kid's football game, you don't want to spend all game out there shooting in the rain. Have a friend with an umbrella, or get one of the many different rain covers for it. And so you do want to be careful around dust, especially changing lenses. While that may not damage the camera, it may get dust on the sensor. So just be aware that changing lenses in a dusty environment is not good either. The other issue that people have questions on is about Nikon accessories, Nikon lenses, batteries, flashes, and things like that. Nikon tests all of their cameras with all of their lenses. They know they work. There will be nothing that is damaged. If you put on something else, Nikon doesn't know exactly what's going to happen. In general, I don't know that I've ever seen a Nikon camera damaged with another piece of equipment like that on there. It's possible. I will say from experience that if you do want to add an additional flash unit, I would highly, highly recommend Nikon. Flash is one of the most complicated areas of photography, and the Nikon system is very good. It may cost you $100 more, but it's well worth that money for that Nikon flash. When it comes to lenses, Nikon is a good first choice, but sometimes they don't make exactly the item you want. And when we get to lenses, I'm going to recommend some different glass that is non-Nikon glass that I think addresses an issue that Nikon has not addressed. And they're totally fine. They work very well on the camera. I can't say that they work 100% because what happens is some of the Nikon lenses have little issues and the Nikon camera knows about it and it fixes those issues. And when you put a Tokina or Tamron lens on there, Nikon doesn't know what minor issues that lens might have and it can't fix them. This is a very, very minor issue, and for people who shoot RAW, it's going to be a non-issue at all. And so if I had this camera, I would have no problem having one of these other brand lenses. In fact, I do own off-brand lenses for my camera. It's not a problem at all. As far as batteries, the Nikon ones are going to be best, but you'll find aftermarket ones, knockoff ones that are a lot less money, and I have found them to be not as good, but overall a kind of good value. And so as a backup battery, an emergency battery, maybe if you're traveling a lot and you want kind of a third battery, it's maybe not a terrible choice for that. I would kind of stick to Nikon for the main batteries. So that's my thoughts on some of those accessories. Now, for the class, hopefully you have charged the battery. It takes about 2.5 hours to charge. You're going to get close to 1,000 shots, and that depends a little bit on if you're shooting in live view, because that uses up more power, how much flash you use, and how much just playing around, looking at your pictures, looking in the menu that you do. You'll get less than that, but about 1,000 shots. And hopefully you've got your lens on, you've got your battery in there, and I went through last night and made sure my battery was charged up for today. You got a memory, you've got 2 memory card slots. We'll talk about that in here. So have some memory in there just because we're going to take some practice pictures in here. And so for right now, just turn your camera to the green auto mode. I'll do that myself. And what I want you to do is, there's the mode dial to the green auto mode. Yes, there we go. Kills me to say that. And then I'm just going to go ahead and just take a picture. Make sure that this camera is working. Pictures of our 2 students here. Now I got a couple of pictures in the memory card. And that's all you need to worry about for right now. You can relax. You don't need to worry about taking notes because we're going to go back to the basics. And I just want to kind of bring people up to speed on a few basics of photography. Now, if you are looking for a photography class, I do have a class called Fundamentals of Digital Photography. This is a downloadable class available with Creative Live, and if you want to know more about what I'm going to talk about over the next couple minutes, you can find it through that class. So this D7100 Nikon camera is a single lens reflex camera. Single lens, we have 1 lens on the camera, very high quality lens. They make wide angle lenses, they make telephoto lenses, they make lenses that zoom back and forth and do all sorts of crazy things. In the lens is an aperture. It's an opening that the light comes through, and the opening is something that you can adjust from very small to very large. And so that's our first way of controlling light in the lens. If you have a lens that goes down to 1.4, that's what we call a fast lens, and it lets in a lot of light. It allows you to use a fast shutter speed. We can stop our lenses down to f/22. It lets in very little light, but it will allow us to do something very creative later on. But this is the first way that we can control light. With each one of these setting adjustments, we're either doubling or cutting the amount of light in half. Beyond just letting in more or less light, the aperture also controls depth of field. As you can see in the photo on the right here, we have very shallow depth of field. The red lines over on the right-hand side indicate the front edge and the back edge of focus. And as we change this aperture down, we're letting in a different amount of light, but we're also increasing our depth of field. You can see those numbers on the yardstick are becoming more and more clear with each setting until we have maximized the amount of depth of field that we can get in this particular situation. So we're using that aperture for multiple reasons in the camera. So once the light enters the camera, in a normal mode, you might say, it's going to hit a mirror and bounce the light upwards so that you can see what's going on. It's going to project an image onto a focusing screen, and that is something that you can see because the light is bounced around through a prism system and out the viewfinder. And so when you look through the viewfinder, you're actually looking at that focusing screen. And so that mirror in there is the reflex portion in single lens reflex. Now when you press down on the shutter release, of course you need to get that mirror up and out of the way so that light can make its way back to the image sensor. And the image sensor is a huge part about cameras, and the 24 megapixel one in this is one that we'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment. In front of the image sensor is a shutter unit, sometimes called a shutter curtain, kind of because they used to be made with cloth, but now they're made with metal blades that move very quickly out of the way. And there's two curtains. There's the first curtain and the second curtain of shutter. And the first one opens up, the second one closes a short time later, exposing each pixel for exactly the same amount of time. And then the mirror returns, and you can see what's going on again. So remember, if you're shooting fast action in this camera or any other SLR, if you saw it, you missed it, because the mirror is in the upward position when you are actually shooting pictures. Now that shutter unit is very important for controlling the light. You can set a fast shutter speed to reduce the amount of light the camera is capturing, but it also enables you to capture very fast action. So 1/2000th of a second. It may just say 2000, but it's actually 1/2000th of a second. These are fractions up here. 1/500th of a second does a good job at stopping human action. So general sports, dancing, things like that. 125th is kind of a pedestrian shutter speed, you might say, stopping the camels walking in the desert. Getting down to slower shutter speeds like 1/30th of a second will cause blurriness if your subjects are moving quickly. In this picture, you can see that the bridge is sharp and the camera was on a tripod, not moving at all, but that's how much blurriness you can expect with people walking at 1/8 of a second. If you like shooting waterfalls and rivers with slow shutter speeds, you'll get this fun effect, kind of a cotton candy misty effect, and that's just simply the use of a long shutter speed. And you can use really long shutter speeds for very creative stuff. This picture I took down in Death Valley. 30 seconds was good for capturing a little bit of the stars in the background, as well as a light swinging around for 30 seconds in the middle of the night. So we talked about the sensor being a very important part about this camera, and one of the things that some people aren't real big up on, if they don't know cameras very well, is the size of sensor in the camera. That has a huge deal as to what type of pictures the camera is best at taking and the capabilities and characteristics of that camera. And so all of these cameras here as examples have different size sensors. We're going to not talk about the really small cameras, the point and shoots and the mirrorless for the most part. The D7100 has a fairly large sensor in it. It's not quite as big as 35 millimeter film, which was kind of the holy grail of digital sensors, you might say, right now. So for all of us shooters that shot 35 millimeter film, it was really convenient when things switched over to digital to just have a digital sensor that was exactly the same size as film, because all of our lenses and everything else worked exactly as normal. Now this is what we call a full frame sensor. Nikon has their own designation, which is called FX. Basically, it's a full frame sensor. And it has a crop factor of 1.0, which is a very fancy way of saying it's a full frame camera and all the lenses work exactly as they did with 35 millimeter film. In order to save money and make smaller cameras, they came up with a smaller size sensor. Nikon calls this crop factor 1.5 a DX sensor, and so we'll talk about DX lenses. You might hear about DX cameras, and they're talking about a camera or lens that works around this 1.5 crop factor sensor. And there are other companies out there that you have some very slight bragging rights against because they have a 1.6 factor. And there are a variety of other sizes that are both smaller and larger than these examples here, but these are some of the most common cameras that you will see on the market. Now, before we get into the real instruction of the camera, one of the things you should check on is to see if you have the strap to your camera connected correctly. I would say that almost 50% of the people that I see have the strap connected incorrectly. And the key thing on the strap is that the tail goes underneath, and that way pressure pushes down on that tail so it does not slip out. A lot of people will put the tail around the top side, and it will wiggle its way loose after a period of time. Next up, just a real simple basic here, holding the camera. Okay, pick the camera up, hold it in your hands, and think about, is your thumb on the top or the bottom of the camera? What's most comfortable and natural to you? And if your thumb is on the bottom, that is actually incorrect. You want to have your thumb on the top of the camera. And the reason you want to have your thumb on the top of the camera is that if you have your thumb on the bottom, your elbow is out here, kind of a chicken wing flapping in the wind. And if you have it underneath, it's generally right up against your torso, which gives you better stability in holding the camera. Also, when you have a longer lens, you can put the base of the lens in the palm of your hand while you're adjusting focus, and it gives you a little bit more torque and control either over focusing and zooming. And I know a lot of people grab the camera like this, but if you look at the professionals, they're all holding their cameras like this, and so it's good to just start practice doing that right now. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And so that's your SLR. If any of that seems like new and or interesting information, you may want to check out the class Fundamentals of Digital Photography. That is, of course, available for download through Creative Live right here. If you go to the catalog, you can just find my name, John Gringo, and right under there it's one of the top listed classes that I have. And so it's got all that basic information for those who need to know it more. Okay. I was going to say, maybe we have a few questions here. I feel like I've been talking nonstop, but I'm just getting started.
No, it's great. It's great. Regarding your quote, if you saw it, you missed it, Sam Cox says, does that advice apply when using the live view mode? Aren't you looking directly through the sensor itself in live view mode?
It is also true in live view. What happens there is that you are seeing exactly what the sensor sees, but it needs to cut out and prep for the actual photograph, and so it does go blank the moment before you take it. And actually, when it's capturing it, it's busy recording the information and not sending it out to the LCD on the back of the camera. So you have to anticipate the moment, no matter what, using these cameras, at least for the current crop of cameras. Someday in the future, I have hopes to see better, something different.
Okay. And everyone, a few people are asking where you purchased this little tripod.
Oh.
You know our audience. Everyone wants to know what you bought and where you bought it.
Right. No, it's a very sturdy little tripod. In fact, I remember using it down in Los Angeles at a track meet, and while it's not built for an 800 millimeter lens, I had an 800 millimeter lens on this because I wanted it right on the ground where I had a little bit of adjustability with it. And the fact of the matter is that I've had this tripod for more than 20 years. And so I don't know if they make it anymore. This is a Bogan, which is now known as Manfrotto. And this is a 3009. And I believe they make a new version of it. I saw one not too long ago in the store. So look under Manfrotto tripods, tabletop tripods. And it works great for these classes because the ball head is a little wimpy. It's just barely okay for a setup like this. If you had a 70 to 200, you would really be taxing it anything other than perfectly level.